This article, originally delivered as a lecture by Colonel Claude Reignier Conder and published on May 29, 1909 in the Hong Kong Daily Press, explores the historical connections between early Chinese civilization and the cultures of West Asia. Titled The Relation of the Early Chinese to the Turanians of West Asia, the lecture examines the diffusion of technologies, language, and cultural practices across ancient trade routes, particularly through eastern Turkestan. Highlighting cultural exchanges and linguistic similarities, Colonel Conder presents the theory that Chinese civilization was not entirely isolated but influenced by the wider known world, ultimately drawing parallels between ancient Chinese and Western Asian traditions.
Before we hear the lecture in its entirety, here's a brief note to frame the experience. The following oration is the complete text as it appeared in the Hong Kong Daily Press in the early part of the 20th century. While its language and viewpoints reflect the scholarly attitudes of its time, they offer a fascinating window into early 20th century perspectives. As you listen, keep in mind that some terms and ideas may seem dated today, but they provide valuable context for understanding the historical dialogue. Now, let's proceed with the article and Colonel Conder's speech.
Under the auspices of the China Society in London, a most interesting lecture was recently delivered by Colonel Conder, Royal Engineers, Doctor of Laws, member of the Royal Asiatic Society, on the relation of the early Chinese to the Turanians of West Asia. General Sir Charles Warren presided and at the conclusion of the lecture made an interesting speech. Colonel Conder said, "I feel some dissidence in addressing the China Society this evening, for I have never myself penetrated so far east as to reach China. As Sir Charles Warren in his kind remarks has said, the main branch of ancient history with which I have been connected is concerned with the far west, with Syria and Babylonia. But I have no doubt that the subject that it is proposed to consider this evening will be of interest to the China Society. As you will see from the card, it is concerned with the relation of the early Chinese to the Turanians of West Asia, with the connection between the early Turanian, or non-Semitic races of West Asia, and the early Chinese. But not only, I think, is this subject interesting to your society, but it is part of a greater subject, the subject of the gradual diffusion of civilization from one or two ancient centers, interesting to various scholars who are more and more coming to that conclusion. Of course, there are others who believe that the same causes led to the same results in different parts of the world, and that similar inventions were independently made by different men in different lands. To me, that suggestion is not altogether satisfactory. It has been stated with regard to other nations, in Greece, and Egypt, and America, but in all these cases I think that scholars are more and more coming to the conclusion that there was a single center, that the great civilization of Greece, wonderfully developed though it was by the Greeks themselves, was originally Asiatic and ultimately Babylonian, that knowledge and art came to them through the civilized tribes of Asia Minor, that the Egyptians themselves owed much of their knowledge in early times to the same Babylonian center, and that even in America, where we find the sporadic civilizations of Mexico and Peru, these came much later from East Asia, through China, Japan, and Siam. And when we compare either modern or ancient civilizations, it seems to me that the peculiarities mark the local development, and the things that are common to two countries indicate the common origin of their civilizations. No doubt the man who first introduced a new discovery or a new invention to a country was in one sense its inventor, and as time went on and the national patriotism disinclined a great nation to think that it owed anything to some smaller nation in the past, he became traditionally the inventor of whatever great idea was attributable to him. In the same way, at the present day we see the whole of the world covered with steam machinery used for every purpose we can imagine, for sea and land transport, mills, railways, and telegraphs, all founded on the simple idea of the piston and cylinder, and valves. But we do not doubt that all these variations spread over the world originated in the one discovery by an Englishman. And again, if we go back to the very earliest times, Take one of the greatest inventions in the world, the alphabet. We find the same story. The world is covered with innumerable alphabets so unlike one another that nothing but the most laborious and detailed examination of their growth would lead us to conclude that they had one origin, and yet we know that they had, and every sound scholar of the subject admits that they arose out of the original Phoenician alphabet. Thus it appears that the idea of the diffusion of an original civilization over the face of Asia, which has gradually developed into various peculiar systems which apparently, at first sight, have little or no connection with one another, is quite a legitimate hypothesis in the case of the Chinese civilization. Of course we have the traditional story in China which I believe is to be found in Yi King, the first of the 5 classics, and according to which at some date about 2900 BC Pso Hai invented nets for fishing and hunting, and a century later Shin Nong, excuse my pronunciation of the words as I am not a Chinese scholar, invented the wooden plow and agricultural implements of various kinds, and barter which began in his time. And from 2700 to 2300 BC under Hu Wang Ti Tao, and Shun, there came the invention of weaving, and of clothes. Boats were hollowed out of trees, and ox carts and horse chariots came into use, and there were forts and bows and arrows. Houses began to be built instead of cave dwellings, and burial mounds were raised, and writing began to be used for agreements, instead of knotted cords which were the only form in earlier times of mnemonics, and which resembled the curious quipus used by the Peruvians at a later period. We cannot say that these various inventions may not have come to China from abroad. These horse chariots, and ox wagons, for instance, were in very early use amongst the people of Babylonia, and amongst the wild Aryans of the steppes of southern Russia, and we cannot say on account of this tradition, considering how like these inventions were to those in other parts of the world, that they were necessarily the peculiar inventions of the Chinese. Coming down to 2300 BC, we reach the time when the Bak tribes, supposed to have been Bactrians, came into China from the west and reached the Yellow River. At one time I was in hopes that some direct information with regard to these Bak tribes would be derivable from various inscriptions, found near the Yenisei River, which it was suggested to me belonged to the time when they were spreading over Mongolia and southern Siberia before they got to China, and with some difficulty I got hold of copies of these inscriptions, which were known as early as 1022, but unfortunately they have nothing to do with the subject. Evidently they are written in the Uyghur alphabet, which was used at a much later time by Turkish tribes as they spread over Central Asia, and they had nothing to do with any of the ancient Chinese hieroglyphics. Thus we are left with comparatively very little information as to these Bak tribes. Now we will turn for a little to the west and consider what was the contemporary civilization of these early times, say, 3000 BC to 2000 BC. At that time there is no doubt that Babylonia or Mesopotamia, that is, the great plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, was in a very high state of civilization. There were 2 races in the country. There was what we call the Semitic race, to which the Babylonians proper and Assyrians belonged, akin to the Syrians and Hebrews and Arabs, a group of races who spoke cognate languages in the southwest of Asia, but they were not the originators of Mesopotamian civilization. It is well known that the Akkadian originators of civilization in Mesopotamia belonged to a Turanian or Mongoloid race, as it is variously called, or an Altaic race as others call it. I mean people who spoke a language different in character from that of the Semitic peoples, and who belonged to that great stock which spread all over Asia, and to which the Chinese are acknowledged to belong as one of the great families, but who were more nearly akin to the Turks and Tartars of Central Asia. These ancient Mesopotamians were the original inventors of the civilization which the Semitic Babylonians afterwards adopted. If we go back to the celebrated King M.R.A.S, who was supposed by Sir Henry Rawlinson to be the same as Amraphel mentioned in the Book of Genesis, there is no doubt that in his time, I think I may say there is strong reason for supposing that he exceeded in 2139 BC, and though some students give the date a century earlier or later, that is the date which appears to me to be now proved. In his time there was an extensive trade organized all over his empire, writing was already reduced to a phonetic system, The science of astronomy not only included the observation of the eclipses of the moon, but they had even fixed their year by inventing an intercalary month, a 13th month which they put in every 3 or 4 years to keep the lunar months in accord with the solar seasons. Then, too, they had severe laws on the subject of irrigation. The whole country was overspread with channels which were kept up by the government, and which made the land so fertile that we can hardly believe the density of population which Babylonia could then support. If we go down to 700 BC, as the time when we know most about the extent of the Assyro-Babylonia Empire, we then find that this civilization extended certainly within the limits of Persia, and was being carried eastward from the centers at Nineveh, and at Babylon. Some scholars have supposed that at this time or even much earlier there was a regular trade along the Great Route to China north of the Kunlun Mountains through Turkestan, and although no cuneiform inscriptions have been found in this part or in India, it is thought that allusions may be supposed to be found in history to this extension of trade. But whatever may be the case as to this, one interesting discovery has actually been made, and that is in regard to white jade. This jade has been found in Babylonia and Assyria, and it has been found at Troy as early at least as 1500 BC. Now many kinds of jade are common enough, but white jade I believe is hardly to be found anywhere in the world except in the Kunlun Mountains, and this white jade must, it is supposed, have come to Western Asia from Central Asia through Babylonia. That would give at least by 1500 BC, and probably earlier, some very palpable evidence of trade between Babylonia and Asia Minor and Central Asia. Of course, one difficulty in supposing that there was any direct communication with China lies in the geographical position. China is very much cut off by the Great Mongolian Steppes on the north, by the Gobi Desert on the west, by the Great Plateau of Tibet and the terrible passes in that direction, and so China is to a certain extent isolated from Western Asia. But there are directions in which China can be entered and has been entered. We know very well that from Manchuria the Mongols came down south in comparatively recent times, and we know there was a trade route through eastern Turkestan on the north side of the Kunlun Range which Dr. Stein has recently been exploring. It was at least as passable in early days as now, and, according to his description, it was apparently more easy to reach China about 200 BC by this great central trade route than at the present time. Besides this, it has been pointed out by various scholars that from Burma also there must have been an entry into Yunnan by various tribes from the west at an early period, and even from the south in the direction of Siam there appears to have been an entrance. Thus, though China appears to be isolated on the whole, there are various ways by which it can be reached from the west of Asia. Historically, I do not venture to say how far the early Chinese dates are generally received as credible, but I suppose that there is no doubt that from 841 BC you have an historical chronology in China, and communication with Afghanistan about 200 BC, with India shortly after, and even with Rome in the 2nd century AD. Therefore China has never from the earliest times of which we have historical notice been entirely cut off from the rest of the world. And now what I propose to do this evening is to go into some details with regard to the parallels of civilization from which you may form some conclusions on the subject, especially details regarding race, and speech, and religion, and science including astronomy, and irrigation, and writing. I do not venture to suppose that I am telling you anything very new, nor have I any claim to have made any great discovery, for although I have investigated this subject independently, it is one that has interested sinologists for the last 30 years. The first scholar who turned my attention to the question was François Lenormant, a great student of the non-Semitic civilization of Babylonia, who made some very enlightening remarks on the connection between the hieroglyphics and the languages of China and of the Akkadians, some 30 years ago. Dr. Chalmers in 1868, and Dr. Edkins in 1871, and Professor Terrion de la Coupérie in 1880, and since him the Reverend C.J. Ball, and several others, have investigated the subject. But, of course, if we are to convince the general public of the reality of this connection it is necessary that the examination should be critical, and that we should remember not only the points of contact but the points of difference. We have one great advantage in the independent studies of the various departments, for as each scholar worked his own department he amassed facts without having any theory of connection to support. And if we take these independent results and put them together we find ourselves on a very sound basis, because the various scholars were working without any knowledge of one another's discoveries. But in China the history seems to me to be more difficult to follow than that of Western Asia because of the absence of very early monuments. Of course we have Chinese written history, but in India, Greece, Babylonia, Egypt, and Syria, our ideas as to the very early times are now based almost entirely on contemporary monumental information, and this fails us in China before about 800 BC. I suppose it will be admitted that China was not an empire, but a series of loosely federated or independent states down to about 200 BC, and there is the great difficulty about the book-burning edict, how far it was carried out, and how far all the books were burned or whether, as it is supposed, some of the works of Confucius, and some of the classics, were hidden away and saved. It is rather a difficulty to find that there was such an edict from 221 BC to 191 BC, that is for 30 years, during which period all books had to be burned, and any scholar found concealing one was to be buried or burned alive, for this casts some little doubt not only on the history of the earliest times, but even upon the later time of Confucius himself. However this may be, the point I want to insist upon is rather that of the existence from early times of foreign influences in China. Lao Tse is admitted, I believe, to have been descended from one of the Burmese tribes. He was not a Chinese. Thus in 600 BC you have a philosopher coming into China from the west, and teaching a mysticism which was very similar to that of the Jains. He may have been a disciple of the great Jain teacher Mahavira. I say Jain and not Buddhist, for it was not the humanism of Gautama's religion, but the mysticism of India that Lao Tse introduced. Coming down to 200 BC you find the Hans in Yunnan in contact with the Burmese civilization of the age of Asoka brought from India, and you find the Hans again in Turkestan in the same age. In 65 AD Buddhism was introduced into China, and 73 AD, Wu Ti repelled the Hans, and the Chinese ruled in Afghanistan till 420 AD and later yet, when Mohammedanism impinged upon them from the west. Then in 166 AD, as I find mentioned in a learned paper, a certain Anton sent an embassy to China. He is supposed to have been Marcus Antoninus, and we know that at this time the Romans had a silk trade, the silk being brought to Rome along the Central Asian trade route, and fabulous prices being paid for it. When we come down to the time of Justinian is 530 we find it said in Chinese history that certain people in the west whose capital was Anto, supposed by some to mean Antioch, tended silkworms. This was about the time when Justinian stole silkworms from China and brought them to Antioch and to the Syrian coast, and began the making of silk in the west. Then coming to 1000 AD you find the Khitai of Central Asia, a great people in the Middle Ages. They had an alphabet of their own much like the Uyghur alphabet, and a civilization of their own, and they subjected the north of China, so that the Chinese are still called by the Russians Khitai, and this Mongolian people thus came in the opposite direction through eastern Turkestan to northern China. Then coming to the 13th century, Mongols, under Chinggis Khan, entered China on the north, and in the time of Marco Polo, Kublai Khan was conquering South China, and even when that dynasty decayed, and the Chinese were left to themselves, the great Ming civilization seems to have been founded on the Mongolian. And then came the Manchus, who brought in a further foreign element. I say, considering these things, we cannot suppose that China was always close to the outside nations from a very early period, and we may therefore think that there must always have been to a certain a mixture of races in China, as there is in every country on the earth even in the earliest times of which we can find any account. So I would ask you with regard to the Chinese race whether you do not consider that there is more than one element of nationality in China. Of course, I am only repeating what I have heard more than one Chinese scholar say when I urge that there are two separate stocks, the North Chinese and the South Chinese. In the north there is the Mongolian element, in the south an element which is perhaps more distinctively Chinese, but nearer akin to the populations of Siam and Burma. Both these stocks belong to the one great race which we call Turanian. Turanian I think is an excellent title for it. Turan was the country beyond Persia, Turkestan, and that was the home from which this great race spread eastward. In China, then, there are now two great branches, the northern branch which is Mongolian Turkish, and the southern which is called Malayan, which perhaps in a softer climate became smaller, with smaller features, and which was more like what we consider typical of the Chinese of the present day. Both stocks have the short head, lank black hair, a beard that does not grow till late in life, a peculiar double fold of the eyelid and a slanting eye. Those peculiarities are to be found in the physiognomy of the northern and southern branches alike. If you go back to the beginning of civilization in the West, 3000 BC, there you find the same Turanian type. The Mongolian and the Turks are, however, nearest to the ancient Akkadian and Hittite or non-Semitic population of West Asia. But both the southern and the northern branches of the Turanians are certainly akin to this one original race. You find portraits of the Hittites, and of the Akkadians themselves, with slanting eyes, and pigtails like those of the Manchus, who forced the pigtail on China in our 17th century. Then if we go still further into the matter, if we study their language we can have no doubt that in ancient Babylonia this stock which has peopled North China existed from the earliest historical period. Professor Tarion de la Coupéry, in 1887, wrote a very interesting book on the languages of China before the Chinese, and collected a large number of the aboriginal dialects mentioned in history, and of the existing dialects of the Aborigines earlier than the civilizing element that come in after. Even among these you constantly find that there are words in the vocabularies which he gives, which are closely similar to the words of the Akkadian language. Now I do not know whether I am heretical in my views, but I have often heard Chinese spoken of as a monosyllabic language, and I have not the slightest idea what that really means. Monosyllabic would mean a language of words that are monosyllables. No doubt the Chinese roots are all monosyllables, so are the roots of a great many other languages, the roots of our own language originally, and the roots of other European languages and of all Turanian languages, are monosyllabic. But although Chinese is in a very early stage of grammar, still I read in the dictionaries that they have clamshell words to denote a particular meaning. If you want to say, to observe, you say to peep, look, and use similar combination that are not peculiar in principle to China, but belong to many other languages if you trace them back far enough. The Chinese also form words by putting the suffix "ki" for the adjective or for the agent, and they form verbs by putting "so" before the root exactly as you find in Turkish and ancient Akkadian, and this even applies to the sound themselves. It has also been stated in a very learned paper I once read that there is an evident connection between Chinese and Mongolian. If it is admitted that this is the case, you have a regular chain from the Mongolian which is most intimately connected with the Turkish, while the Turkish is the direct descendant of the ancient Akkadian. If it is admitted that the Mongolian and the Chinese have a connection, you thus have necessarily a chain of language connecting you with Babylonia. The Akkadian, however, is much nearer to the Turkish, the pure Turkish of Central Asia, than it is to Chinese. I have had cause to investigate that matter, and I have found that nearly half the vocabulary of the Akkadian is the same as modern Turkish, and the grammar is on exactly the same principles in the two languages. Of course, they are more advanced than is the Chinese. The Chinese is a more primitive language, but in many of its weak points, such as the want of defining time for the verb, absence of gender, and so on, it has the same weakness that the ancient Akkadian had. Professor Tarion de la Coupéry was the first, I think, to give a great impulse to this study of the two languages. In 1860, in a lecture at the Society of Arts on the early history of Chinese civilization, he brought out a list of 50 ancient Chinese words which he compared with 50 ancient Akkadian words. I do not venture to express any opinion on the Chinese words, but he was not always right in regard to Akkadian words, yet at least half of his comparisons were certainly convincing. But then words alone are not sufficient, because all the possibilities of loans from other languages have to be considered. I went into this subject some years ago and I learned from Idle's dictionary, published in 1877, and from Chalmers' dictionary, published in 1878, that the Cantonese was regarded as the oldest of Chinese dialects. Idle says that this dialect was derived directly from the ancient Chinese language, and thus it appeared that the Cantonese dialect was the safest for the purpose of comparison with Akkadian. Chalmers says that the old terminations of the words are better preserved in Cantonese than in the Mandarin dialect. So I went through the Mandarin dictionary, by Doolittle, published in 1872, and found it was evident that the Cantonese was a much older dialect than the Mandarin, though the Mandarin preserves the initials, and I found at least 90 or 100 Cantonese words that were evidently the same as in Akkadian. Well, you will say 90 or 100 words are not much out of a dictionary of 10,000 words, but you will remember that in early times vocabularies were not large. It is said, though this is disputed, that even the English peasants of the present day do not really use more than 500 words, and, in the inscriptions found on monuments in Akkadian, only about 400 words are used. Therefore, if you consider the limitations of these old vocabularies, to find a quarter of the Akkadian words preserved in a dialect at the present day is something well worthy of the consideration of specialists who could say what the oldest forms of Chinese words were. I do not think that the connection with Akkadian can be very close, because the grammar is not the same, and grammar is a more permanent element in a language than is the vocabulary. The pronouns are not the same, and the numerals are not the same as in the Akkadian, and there are other points in which the Akkadian differs very greatly from the oldest Chinese that we can study. But still the two languages belong to the same class, and appear to have had a remote connection. That seems to be the conclusion at which anyone who has studied the subject in detail must arrive. So much in regard to language and race. In regard to religion, there is no doubt that the general principles of native religion in China are exactly the same that you find in ancient Babylonia and Syria amongst the Akkadians and Hittites. For instance, the great sacrifices in China to heaven and earth, which were the two principal Akkadian deities. Then there are the middle sacrifices to the sun and moon and various other deities, and you find these gods coinciding with what were the old Akkadian secondary, and the inferior are to the clouds, and the rain, and the wind, and the thunder, and the mountains, and the rivers, and the seas. Well, we have a treaty of the 14th BC made by the Hittites, their great treaty with Ramesses II, and in this they swore by the clouds, wind, mountains, rivers, and sea. So you could not have a closer comparison of two systems of animism than that which is found in this ancient inscription and in the account of Chinese sacrifices. If you turn to the myths about the duties, you come to much the same result. There are the three kings, three Chinese kings who are exactly like the three great gods of heaven, and earth, and hell that you find in Babylonia. And you have the story of Puiku, who was turned into various elements, or sacrificed himself to himself, and from whom the whole creation them sprang. Well, you have very much the same story about Gayamerd in Persia and Marduk in Babylonia, who made man from his own blood. And the flood story you find all over Asia and Europe. In China the flood is a river flood. I do not know whether that is sufficient to make it distinct from a sea flood, but even the Babylonian floods were due to the rising of rivers. And above all you have the story of paradise. It is notable that the paradise of China is in the west, that the Indian paradise with its tree of life was in the northwest, that the Hebrew paradise was in the east, and the Babylonian paradise, as far as we can judge, was really also in the east. It seems as if these peoples all remembered the home from which they came. Their old home was paradise to them, and as they spread over the earth, those who went east had their paradise behind them in the west, and those who went west thought of the paradise behind them in the east. The Kunlun paradise has a jeweled peach tree just as the other paradises have the tree of life. They all, to my mind, must have come from one original, from one central story. Then, too, there are other legends connecting China with the West. The legend, for instance, of the wolf child, of the child suckled by a wolf, in China attributed to the country of the Huns, where Quenmo, a wonderful child nursed by a wolf, became a hero. which is the same story that we get in Rome, and Romulus and Remus were not Aryans at all. The legend is Etruscan, and a story of the Etruscans means a Turanian story in Italy. The legend of the wolf child is found also in India amongst the Turanian, non-Aryan, peoples. There is also the story of the three maidens who bathed in a wonderful lake and who became the mothers of heroes. You have that story in China, and you find it too in Persia. It is a story very well known among the Zoroastrians of Persia. I may mention too the extraordinary conveyed custom, a custom by which it is necessary that the father should remain in bed and nurse the baby for 40 days while the mother goes about and does the work of the house, a most extraordinary and abnormal custom you would say, and this custom was described by Marco Polo in China. Yet it is not only known there, and even known in California, but you find it in India, and you find it in Pontus in the north of Asia Minor, and amongst the Basque people in France. But in every case it is of Turanian origin, so that when the author of M.R.A.S laughs at it as a Chinese custom, he might, he known, have found it among the Basques in France, much nearer home.
Thank you for watching.